Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I might be between you and your first coffee break, so don't let me stop you. If you need to get up and stretch, by all means. So when John said, would you give a little talk about things that are happening outside of New York, I think I dramatically underestimated the diversity of the people in this room. I think based on already whom we've heard from, I'm demonstrably underqualified to talk about this. That said, I'm a serial startup founder and CTO, so I have never let being underqualified stop me from giving my opinion. So, Google Cloud, as many of you know, has a Google Cloud startup program. You'll hear a little bit more about it later, but a couple things that are the highlight here. We partner with tons of ecosystem folks. That's VCs, accelerators, incubators, code schools, university entrepreneurship programs, co-working spaces. Over 750 that identify as an accelerator or an incubator alone globally, and 70% of those are outside the US. Right? So if you're still drawing in your head this kind of picture of the US, you know, the map projection of the US as this outsized entity, I think it's worth noting that these partners truly are global. We brought in over 10,000 startups into Google Cloud last year. And I point that out again because we're at scale, and to talk a little bit about why we love accelerators as partners. So we're in this incredibly fortunate position of not being in the business of picking the winners. So many of you, your business model depends on picking the winners, VCs, but also accelerators, and the way we think about returns, the way we think about the reputation of these. We love working with accelerators because you're picking the winners. You're also helping to amplify our message. We're an incredibly small team, global but small, and we need partners to amplify that message. You're doing it at a stage that matters to platform partners like us. There are folks who can help startups with their scale-up stage. There are folks who can help startups with their infrastructure level. We love those seed and Series A companies at Google. And finally, accelerators are unique, especially over VCs in our world, because you have this density of startups. There's these amazing spaces. The idea that you're getting all these companies in one place is highly efficient access to startups. And so we love that, right? Obviously, it helps the startups themselves, but I think as a vendor, we also love that. So this is where our team lives, and I do want to talk a little bit about the things that we see globally. I'll touch on a couple of themes. Oh, look, they all jumped ahead. Great. So, I have this privilege of, in this role, being able to travel all over the country, all over the world, and visiting all of these different ecosystems. So I want to talk about three things. These are not inclusive of the broad picture. I will mention, Mark talked about the Startup Genome Project. It's really great. I tend to not put anything on slides that I could Google. So do me a favor, Google the Startup Genome Project. It really is a fascinating data set to talk about these ecosystems. But I'll touch a little bit on my own reflections and experiences about both the maturity, a bit about corporates and government involvement, and then some things we see for kind of the hubs and the community. So the first thing to keep in mind is every startup city that I visit is crushing it. Right? We spend a lot of time in startup networking events. We know that 9 out of 10 startups are failing. At a networking event, 9 out of 10 startups are crushing it. And I actually don't think this is a bad thing. Like at first, I was a little, I'm based in Boston, and I've been a serial founder, and I had one company that I ran in New York, and listening to Mark Thomas talk about New York is incredible. It's also, in the startup parlance, it's a unicorn of startup ecosystems, right? There are a few of these unicorns, and you guys are a unicorn. Man, $130 million for Made in New York space. Like, what would Rio give for $130 million for their entire ecosystem? It's incredible. And a little shade on Portland there, right? That Hudson Yards is kind of, whoo, it's rough. So I think it's worth us appreciating that New York and Silicon Valley and Boston and LA, these are kind of the four ecosystems, I think, in North America that are the most mature. These are ones that have kind of moved out of that teenage years. They're in a steady state. They're growing, they're evolving, they're changing, but they really have reached a level of maturity that is the envy of cities all over the world. So whenever I go to a new market, I tend to ask 3 questions of the people who have been there a long time. First is, where's the money coming from here? The second one is, where do you get talent? And the third is, where are your ideas? And that's a framework that's kind of worked well for me as I look at all these cities. So by way of example, in the US, the money is coming from all sorts of private sources. But we'll touch a little bit on governments. When I go even just across the border to Canada, I was in Toronto a couple weeks ago, and go Raptors. And Toronto, it's amazing when you talk to seed stage companies and you ask them about where they've raised money, how much money they've raised, their cap table. Almost all of them say, oh, well, and I have some money from a grant. Like it's coming from government grants. There's all these startups that have money from the government. When we hear like SoftBank talks about putting $5 billion into LATAM, India has a $5 billion fund out of the government just for India. I mean, so there are these incredible government sources that I think we don't fully appreciate in the US, where we've had the luxury of private capital for so long being deployed through VCs and accelerators and corporates. From a talent perspective, this is the thing that I hear the most in cities, is the talent. And while I totally appreciate that anyone who's not in New York should move to New York, I think Amy would agree that, man, there's so many places that really want talent. So how do we think about getting those talent out? When I'm in Boston, we have the great privilege of incredible university talent coming out. And in a place like Toronto, you see that. Miami has this really interesting state where there's a ton of talent that comes to Miami. I think it's something like 65% of people in Miami didn't grow up in Miami. So there's incredible influx from all over the world coming into that ecosystem, and that shapes the way that they think about their talent. And then from an ideas perspective, it's really interesting to see how the ecosystems have shaped their ideas around, number one, the businesses that exist already there, and then also the money. So I think there is this truism that people who are investing money are investing in the things they know. So I don't think I can name an agricultural tech company in New York, startup right now. I'm sure there are some, but I can't name one. But you go to Chicago and you find angel investors who weren't born on Wall Street, but instead were born in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and they're angel investing into agricultural tech startups. And you get the Techstars partners all over the globe are going to bringing their industry expertise in their particular region. We see that a ton, and we see that the ideas are coming from the unique needs of an ecosystem. So the amount of mobile finance companies coming out of Mexico City is staggering. Like, they only pay with their mobile phone. The idea that they're carrying credit cards around, or that they're writing checks, or even using the big payment players like Apple Pay or Google Pay, they have tons of startups that are doing that, and they're all doing it through chat. WeChat is prominent, so there's massive ideas that come out of the local ecosystem characteristics. All right, so this one, let's talk about corporates and governments. At the risk of SAP security escorting me out, honestly, they usually have no plan. I see this everywhere I go, and I'll say this is another thing where a place like New York is really far ahead. So we see a very evolved group of corporates in this room here. And I think we see this happening all over the world. When I look in Latin America, every single big bank has an accelerator. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's like the Santander accelerator. You've got the Bradesco Innovabra Habitat co-working space. It's this incredible space like this. And you ask them, hey, why do you do this? What's the point? And they give a word that I've already heard a lot here too, which is they say, oh, it's about innovation. We're sharing, it's an innovation thing. When you dig down and ask what they mean, they're honestly not sure. So they might want to invest in startups. They might be looking for returns. They might be looking to acquire those startups later. So not from an equity standpoint, but an acquisition standpoint. Sometimes they see a customer relationship, a partnership. Sometimes they have FOMO. Their board of directors told them that they're going to be disrupted. And so someone wrote a $10 million budget to avoid disruption. And so now they're going out and saying it's probably a startup thing, but they're not sure what. Sometimes they're looking to stimulate the economy, which I think is great. Some of them are saying, we want to give back to our ecosystem. You get folks like, we talked about where the money comes from. In Miami, you have the Knight Foundation, which came out of the Miami Herald fortune. They pumped $250 million, I think back in 2012, into that Miami ecosystem and really sort of turned the crank on how that was going to work. 500 startups is now there. They've got a bunch of interesting spaces we'll talk about in a minute. So watching them give back to the ecosystem is great too. I think this is okay. And I'll talk in a minute, but I think the challenge here is, how do we help them? I think it's really great that we see the corporate involvement. And for people who haven't yet figured out why you're doing it, I think there's a responsibility from us as accelerators, as people who are closer in the ecosystem, to kind of help with that guidance. The final theme I'll touch on is this hubs and community. This is a really interesting one. Fewer cities than I would imagine have what I'd call a single central startup hub, a place where everyone says that's the center of gravity for startups. I would argue New York doesn't have one. It's really big. There's lots of people who have incredible spaces in New York. And there's people who continue to invest and say, can we become that center? Places that do have it, the one that I hear most about is Chicago's 1871. I'm sure many of you have been there. That's one that I hear referenced all the time by people who are aspirationally looking at physical space as a hub. In Miami, the CIC, which was born in my backyard in Boston, Tim Rowe, the Cambridge Innovation Center, was around forever, have now started exporting. The CIC in Miami is interesting, in part because it meets a few of these criteria. So number one, everyone wants to be a hub. We know that very few of them succeed. I mean, 1871, everyone then talks about 1776, which was the one in DC. One of the things that happened with the 1776 space in DC was they immediately started trying to expand to other places. It takes patience. I think as startup founders, we love this idea that we have this incredible big vision and we want to move quickly on it. I will say community takes patience. CIC has been around. I started one of my first startups there in 2003, and it had already been around for a few years. And it took them more than a decade before they tried to expand anywhere else. And the last one is, don't go it alone on this. So if you're building a hub, you need the support of other folks. And what the CIC in Miami did, for example, is they've got a co-working space. They've got the Babson Wind Lab in there. They've got a handful of VCs, as does 1871 in Chicago. They've got Startup Boot Camp in there. So I would say if you are looking to build a hub, and in New York, that's going to be much more concentrated in a particular area. There was a great speaker last year here who talked about the ecosystem in Harlem and the growth there and the importance of that. So if we're looking to build local hubs, I think it's equally important to say we're not going it alone. So let me wrap up with a challenge for a few of these. Some of them on the themes we talked about, and then a few others from our experience as a vendor. One is, accelerators have an opportunity to be a part of that community. I see most accelerators so focused on the cadence of their cohorts and the cadence of their returns and raising the fund and figuring out how they work with corporates that they are failing to tap into, as they mature, this incredible alumni strategy. So I work a lot with Techstars and Jeremy and John, and thinking about how does Techstars do it. I know they've struggled with it. They have this amazing alumni community that I think is not nearly as engaged as it could be. We see this a lot with accelerators. So first is, how do you engage those alumni? Another one is, help the corporates measure their success. So while I'm on Techstars, they also do a great job of this because it's their business model. They go out and they say, we can help you, and here's why you should build an accelerator with us. And so they've had to be really thoughtful about structuring what success looks like for those corporates. I think we can all do a better job of that. Join forces for your local tech hubs. Let's not go that alone. From a vendor perspective, ask us for more. We'll say no, by the way, because we're small and we don't have a lot of resources and we can't spread it everywhere. But it's really important for those of you who know your ecosystems the best, who know your startups the best, who know the things that are going to provide authentic value into yours, we can't guess at that. So while it sort of seems like it's great, Google and Amazon and Microsoft and other vendors will come in and say, here's the programs we offer, here's the things we can do. We want to hear from you how those programs evolve. So please don't be shy. Be scrappy, act like an entrepreneur, and ask for more than you know you'll get. And the final one is to support other growing ecosystems. We heard it from Amy. You have to be there. It's been incredible. It's been humbling and eye-opening for me to get to visit so many ecosystems outside of my own bubble of starting companies in Boston and in New York and having all the advantages that come with that. I do think you need to get out there. You need to help those. When you are ready to expand, there's amazing work happening from people in this room. Our friends at Antler have moved from Singapore and now expanding around the world. We want to help grow those local ecosystems, and the more you can get out in them, the more perspective we'll have there. How did I do on time? Man, I kind of nailed it on time. So I love to discuss this stuff. There's so much that we can't talk about in 15 minutes. So I'll be around for the whole rest of the day. Would love to talk to as many folks and take questions and have great discussion. Thank you all for being here.